Hanna pressed her face against the cold window of the research station and watched the sky burn. The aurora lights that usually danced green and blue across the Antarctic night had turned blood red. Something was very wrong with the world tonight. She pulled her thick jacket tighter and turned back to her computer screen. The data from the ice core samples could wait, but the strange readings from the atmospheric sensors needed her attention right now. Numbers scrolled across the screen that made no sense. Radiation levels were spiking in patterns she had never seen before. Her colleague Dongwu burst through the door, his face white with panic. Snow covered his dark hair, and his breathing came in short gasps. He had been outside checking the communication equipment when the sky started changing colors. "Hanna, you need to see this," he said, fumbling with his tablet. "The radio signals, they are not from Earth." She moved away from her workstation and looked at his screen. Waves of data showed transmission patterns unlike anything human technology could produce. The frequencies were too complex and the power levels were impossible with current Earth science. "Maybe it is just interference from the solar storm," she suggested. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were wrong. These patterns had structure and purpose. They looked like language. Dongwu shook his head and pulled up another screen. "No solar storm does this. Look at the satellite feeds from the major cities." The images made Han-Na's stomach drop. Massive dark shapes hung in the sky above Seoul, Tokyo, New York, and London. They were ships, but not like any ships humans had ever built. They stretched for kilometers and blocked out the stars with their bulk. "How long have they been there?" she asked. "About 30 minutes. The news channels went dark 15 minutes ago. The internet is mostly down, too." Hanna sat down slowly in her chair. She had studied xenobiology for 6 years, always wondering if life existed beyond Earth. Now she had her answer, and it was not the peaceful first contact she had imagined in her textbooks. The building shook suddenly, rattling the equipment and sending coffee mugs sliding across tables. Through the windows, they could see strange lights moving across the ice fields in the distance. The lights were getting closer. "We need to contact the main base," Hanna said, reaching for the emergency radio. Static filled the speakers when she tried to tune to any frequency. The electromagnetic interference was too strong. Dongwu was typing frantically on his computer, trying to send messages through the few internet connections that still worked. "I am getting reports from research stations all over Antarctica. The same lights are appearing everywhere. They are surrounding us." Another tremor shook the building, stronger this time. Equipment fell from shelves and the lights flickered. Through the static on the radio, they heard fragments of voices speaking in languages that sounded almost human, but were somehow wrong in ways they could not explain. "What do we do?" Dongwu asked. Han-Na looked around the small research station that had been her home for the past 8 months. She had come here to study ancient microorganisms trapped in the ice, hoping to learn about early life on Earth. The irony was not lost on her that she might be about to meet life from somewhere else entirely. "We document everything," she said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "We record what we see and try to understand what is happening." She grabbed her notebook and started writing down times, descriptions, and measurements. Her scientific training took over, pushing down the fear that wanted to paralyze her thoughts. Data was data, whether it came from ice samples or alien invaders. The lights outside were much closer now. They could see that they were not just lights but vehicles of some kind, gliding silently over the snow without touching the ground. The vehicles were sleek and dark, reflecting the aurora glow in ways that made them seem alive. "Han-Na," Dongwu whispered, pointing at his screen. "I am picking up movement signatures all around us, dozens of them." She nodded and continued writing. "Distance approximately 2 kilometers and closing. Vehicles appear to use anti-gravity technology. No visible propulsion system. No sound from engines." The building shook again, and this time the lights went out completely. Emergency power kicked in a few seconds later, bathing everything in red light. The computers rebooted slowly while Han-Na continued writing by hand. Through the windows, they could see figures moving in the snow. They were tall and thin, wearing what looked like armor that gleamed even in the dim light. Their movements were too smooth and coordinated to be human. "They are coming for the building," Dongwu said. His voice was steady now, like Han-Na's. Fear was giving way to fascination despite the danger. Han-Na closed her notebook and slipped it into her jacket pocket. She looked around the room at all the equipment and research that represented years of work. Whatever happened next, she wanted to remember every detail. The door exploded inward without warning. The metal crumpled like paper and flew across the room. 3 figures stepped through the opening, and Han-Na got her first clear look at beings from another world. They were humanoid, but wrong in subtle ways that made her skin crawl. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent at slightly incorrect angles. Their armor covered most of their bodies, but she could see pale skin underneath that seemed to glow with its own light. The center figure raised what was obviously a weapon and pointed it at them. The weapon hummed with energy and cast strange shadows on the walls. Dongwu raised his hand slowly, following the universal gesture of surrender. Han-Na found herself studying the aliens instead of being afraid. Their faces were visible through transparent sections of their helmets, and she could see that their eyes were larger than human eyes and completely black. Their mouths were too wide and filled with too many teeth. The alien spoke in a voice that sounded like music played through broken speakers. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was clearly a command. When neither human responded, the alien spoke again, louder and more harshly. Dongwu tried to respond in English, then Korean, then Chinese. The alien tilted its head at the sounds but showed no sign of understanding. It gestured with its weapon, toward the door. Han-Na stepped forward slowly, keeping her hands visible. She pointed at herself and said, "Han-Na," clearly. Then she pointed at Dongwu and said, "Dongwu." The alien watched this with what might have been curiosity. She then pointed at the alien and raised her eyebrows in question. The alien studied her for a long moment before making a sound that might have been its name, or might have been a curse. The sound had too many syllables and used tones that human throats could not produce. One of the other aliens moved to the research equipment and began examining it with obvious interest. It ran devices over the computers and sensors, taking readings or possibly copying data. The third alien searched through their supplies and personal belongings. The leader kept its weapon trained on the humans, but Han-Na noticed that its posture was relaxed. It did not seem to consider them a threat. She found this interesting rather than insulting. These beings had technology that could destroy human civilization, so 2 researchers in Antarctica were hardly worth worrying about. Minutes passed in tense silence while the aliens completed their examination of the station. They seemed particularly interested in the atmospheric monitoring equipment and the communication devices. One of them spent a long time studying Dongwu's computer screen, with the radio wave analysis still displayed. Finally, the leader made a gesture that was clearly an order to move. Han-Na and Dongwu were herded out of the building into the Antarctic night. The cold hit them immediately despite their heavy clothing. The aliens seemed unaffected by the temperature. A larger vehicle waited outside, dark and silent like the others. Its hull was smooth and featureless except for what might have been windows or sensors. A section of the hull slid open without any visible mechanism, revealing an interior lit by the same pale glow as the alien skin. As they were pushed toward the vehicle, Han-Na looked back at the research station one last time. She had expected this night to be like any other night, analyzing data and writing reports. Instead, she was about to leave Earth entirely. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange excitement. She was about to learn things about the universe that no human had ever known before. The journey through space lasted 3 days, though Han-Na had no way to be certain about time in the windowless cell where they kept her. The ship moved without any sensation of acceleration or vibration, which told her that their technology was far beyond anything humans had achieved. She spent the time observing everything she could about her prison. The walls were made of some material that felt warm to the touch and seemed to absorb sound. The lighting came from the walls themselves rather than any visible source. Most interesting was the way the room seemed to anticipate her needs, providing food and water at regular intervals through openings that appeared and disappeared without seams. Dongwu had been taken to a different cell, and she had not seen him since they left the research station. She hoped he was safe, but worrying would not help either of them now. Instead, She focused on learning as much as possible about their captors. The food they provided was nutritious but bland, suggesting they understood human biology well enough to keep her healthy. This implied either extensive study of humans or contact with other species, similar enough to humans that the same nutrition would work. Both possibilities were fascinating from a scientific perspective. On what she estimated was the fourth day guards came for her. They were the same tall, pale beings she had seen at the research station, but these wore different armor with more elaborate designs. Their weapons were also more ornate, decorated with symbols that might have been writing or purely decorative elements. They escorted her through corridors that curved in ways that made no geometric sense. The ship was much larger than she had realized, with passages that seemed to stretch for kilometers. They passed many other beings along the way, some that looked like her guards, and others that were clearly different species entirely. Han-Na tried to memorize everything she saw. Short, heavily muscled beings with gray skin worked at maintenance tasks. Tall, insect-like creatures moved in groups, communicating through rapid clicking sounds. Most interesting were beings that looked almost human, except for their bright blue skin and the fact that they seemed to float slightly above the floor. All of these beings moved aside when her guards approached, and Han-Na noticed that many of them would not meet her eyes. They seemed afraid, but not of her. The fear was directed at her guards or perhaps at where they were taking her. The corridors eventually opened into a vast chamber that took Han-Na's breath away. The ceiling stretched so high that it disappeared into shadows, and the walls were covered with what looked like crystal formations that pulsed with inner light. The space was large enough to hold several city blocks, but it was what the crystals contained that made her stomach turn. Inside each formation was a figure, perfectly preserved but clearly dead. They were beings from dozens of different species, all frozen in poses of absolute terror. Their faces showed expressions of fear so pure and intense that looking at them made Han-Na feel cold despite the warm air. At the center of the chamber sat a throne that seemed to be carved from a single massive black stone. The throne was surrounded by floating platforms at different levels, creating a complex three-dimensional court. On these platforms stood more beings, all facing toward the throne with postures of submission. On the throne sat the being Han-Na immediately knew must be their king. He was larger than the guards, at least 3 meters tall, with the same pale skin but covered in intricate patterns that seemed to move when she was not looking directly at them. His armor was not really armor at all, but some kind of living material that flowed over his body like liquid metal. Most striking were his eyes, which were not black like the guards but glowed with a cold blue light. The guards pushed Han-Na forward until she stood at the base of the throne. The king studied her with those glowing eyes, and she felt a pressure in her mind, like something trying to push its way inside her thoughts. She pushed back instinctively, the same way she might resist a strong wind. The king made a sound that might have been surprise. The pressure in her mind increased, becoming almost painful, but Han-Na gritted her teeth and maintained her mental resistance. Around the chamber she could hear murmurs from the watching beings, as if something unexpected was happening. After several minutes, the pressure stopped. The king leaned back in his throne and spoke in the same musical language she had heard from the guards. One of the floating platforms descended, carrying a being she recognized with shock. It was Jiho, a communications engineer she knew from the Seoul Research Consortium. He looked terrible, with hollow eyes and pale skin, as if he had not eaten or slept properly in weeks. When he spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. "King Vorthak wishes to know why you do not fear him," Jiho translated. "All beings fear the king when they stand before his throne. You are the first to resist his mental touch." Han-Na looked up at the king, then around at the crystal formations with their trapped victims. Understanding began to dawn on her. "He feeds on fear," she said to Jiho. "That is why all these beings are preserved in terror. He keeps them that way to maintain his power." Jiho translated her words, and the king responded with obvious displeasure. Several of the guards moved closer, their weapons humming with energy. "The king says you will learn fear soon enough. He has brought your sister to teach you proper respect." Another platform descended, and Hanna's heart stopped. Subin stood on the platform, but like Jiho, she looked broken and empty. Her sister had always been the brave one in their family, a fighter pilot with nerves of steel. Seeing her reduced to this hollow state filled Hanna with rage rather than fear. "Subin," she called out, but her sister did not respond. She stared straight ahead with vacant eyes, as if she could not see or hear anything around her. King Vorthak spoke again, longer this time, and his voice carried undertones that made Hanna's skin crawl. Jiho translated with the same emotionless voice. "The king says your sister resisted at first, like you. But all beings break eventually when they understand the true scope of his power. He has conquered 1,000 worlds and enslaved 1,000,000 species. Your world is nothing special, just another addition to his empire." Hanna studied the king as Jiho spoke. His posture was confident, almost lazy, as if this was a routine he had performed countless times before. But she noticed something else. The patterns on his skin were moving more slowly than when she had first seen him, and the glow in his eyes seemed slightly dimmer. "How long has he ruled?" she asked. Jiho translated the question and received a long response. 3,000 years. He has lived longer than most species exist because the fear of his subjects sustains him. The more terror he inspires, the stronger he becomes. And what happens when beings stop being afraid? This question seemed to surprise both Jiho and the king. After some back-and-forth translation, Jiho responded. "The king says this is impossible. All beings fear death and pain, and the loss of what they love. Fear is the most basic emotion in the universe." Hanna nodded thoughtfully. "But what if there are beings who are more curious than afraid? What if some creatures find the unknown exciting rather than terrifying?" The king leaned forward on his throne, and Hanna felt the mental pressure return. This time it was different, not trying to induce fear, but trying to read her thoughts directly. She let him probe the surface of her mind, showing him her memories of studying alien life, her excitement at making contact with other species, her fascination with technologies beyond human understanding. The king jerked back as if burned. He spoke rapidly to Jiho, who looked confused as he translated. "The king says, he says your mind tastes wrong. Where there should be fear, you have something else. Something that makes him feel weak." Around the chamber, Hanna could see the other beings watching with growing interest. Some of them were whispering to each other, and she noticed that several were no longer looking at the ground in submission. She decided to test her theory. "Tell the king I want to study his species. I want to understand how his technology works, and how his empire is organized. I want to learn about the other species he has conquered and how they have adapted to his rule." As Jiho translated, Hanna watched the king's reaction carefully. The patterns on his skin slowed even more, and he seemed to shrink slightly in his throne. When he responded, his voice lacked the commanding tone he had used before. "The king says you will be kept alive for further study. You are to be confined to quarters appropriate for a being of your status." "What status is that?" Jiho asked the question and received a response that clearly puzzled him. "The king says you are classified as a..." The word does not translate well. Something like dangerous anomaly or system error. Hanna smiled for the first time since her capture. In her experience, system errors were often the most interesting things to study. They revealed weaknesses and unexpected behaviors that could lead to breakthrough discoveries. As the guards prepared to escort her away, she looked up at King Vorthak one more time. The being who had ruled a galactic empire for 3,000 years was staring at her with something she had never expected to see in the eyes of a conqueror. Uncertainty. She had found his weakness, and now she needed to figure out how to exploit it. Not just for herself, but for her sister, for Earth. The quarters they assigned to Hanna were far more luxurious than anything she had expected. The room was large enough to house a small family, with furniture that seemed to adapt to her body shape and preferences. The walls displayed what appeared To be views of different worlds probably meant to impress her with the scope of the king's empire. But Hanna saw something else in these displays. Each world showed signs of the same architectural style, the same types of buildings and infrastructure. This suggested a standardized approach to conquest and occupation, which meant the king's forces followed predictable patterns. She began her work immediately, treating her imprisonment like a research assignment. The room provided everything she requested through some kind of automated system, including writing materials and basic scientific instruments. Either the king wanted to keep her comfortable, or his systems were designed to satisfy the needs of prisoners automatically. Her first priority was establishing communication with other human prisoners. During her escort through the ship, she had noticed several beings that looked human despite their strange clothing. If they were indeed from Earth, they might have valuable information about the invasion and the king's weaknesses. The communication system in her room allowed her to access what seemed to be a ship-wide network. Most of it was in alien languages she could not read, but she found sections that used symbols and mathematical concepts that were universal. Through careful experimentation, she learned to navigate the system and locate other users. On the third day, she made contact with someone who responded to mathematical sequences she sent out. The response came in broken English with Korean phrases mixed in, confirming that she had found another human. "Who is this?" came the message. "Are you really human?" Hanna Kim, xenobiology researcher from Antarctica Station 7. "Who are you?" Min Soo, park engineering officer from Seoul Defense Force. "How are you sending messages? They told us communication was impossible." Hanna explained her discovery of the network access, and Min Soo was able to connect several other humans to their conversation. Within hours, she was talking to a dozen humans from different parts of Earth, all captured during the initial invasion. The information they shared painted a grim picture. The invasion had been swift and decisive, with major population centers surrendering within days of the ship's arrival. Earth's military forces had fought bravely but were completely outmatched by alien technology. But there were also encouraging signs. Many humans had refused to surrender even when defeat was certain, and resistance movements were forming in rural areas around the world. Unlike other species the aliens had conquered, humans seemed unable or unwilling to accept permanent defeat. "They do not understand us," wrote Tae-young, a diplomat who had been captured while trying to negotiate Earth's surrender. "Their translators keep making errors when they try to interpret human concepts like hope and defiance. I think these emotions are foreign to most galactic species." Through their growing network, Hanna learned about other human prisoners scattered throughout the ship. Kyung-ho, her own brother, was being held in a research facility several levels below her quarters. The aliens were studying human biology and psychology, trying to understand why humans reacted differently to conquest than other species. This gave Hanna an idea. If the aliens were studying humans to understand them, she could use that curiosity to gather information about alien society and technology. She began requesting meetings with alien researchers, claiming she wanted to share information about human biology and culture. The first alien scientist to visit her was a tall, thin being with gray skin and 4 arms. It introduced itself through a translation device as something like Researcher Vex, and seemed genuinely interested in learning about human biology. Hanna answered its questions honestly, describing human anatomy, reproduction, and social structures. But she also asked questions in return, learning about the scientist's own species and their role in the Galactic Empire. "Your species is very strange," Vex told her through the translator. "Most beings fear pain and death above all else. But humans seem to fear loss of freedom more than physical harm. This makes no evolutionary sense. Maybe evolution on Earth worked differently than on other worlds," Hanna suggested. "What about your species? How did they evolve?" Through careful questioning, she learned that Vex's people had been among the first species conquered by King Vorthak. They had originally been explorers and scientists, but centuries of rule by the fear-feeding king had made them passive and submissive. They now served as researchers and technicians for the Empire, their curiosity carefully controlled and directed. You miss being free? Hanna asked during one session. Vex was quiet for a long time before answering. We do not remember freedom. That is the gift the king gives us. We do not remember pain when we no longer feel it. But Hanna noticed something in Vex's behavior that suggested the scientist was not as emotionally dead as it claimed. When discussing research and discovery, Vex became more animated, and its language became more complex. Some part of its original nature still existed under the imposed submission. She began sharing her own research methods and scientific approaches with Vex, describing how humans approached problems and tested theories. To her surprise, Vex seemed hungry for this information, asking detailed questions about human creativity and innovation. Human scientists work very differently from galactic researchers, Vex observed. You question everything, even fundamental assumptions. Most species accept the reality they are given. Is that because the king discourages questions? The king provides all necessary knowledge. Questions imply dissatisfaction with the king's wisdom. Hanna filed this information away, with growing excitement. If the king's power depended on preventing subjects from questioning reality, then humans represented a fundamental threat to the entire system. Human nature was built around asking questions and challenging assumptions. Through her conversations with Vex and other researchers, she learned more about the king species and their feeding habits. They were indeed parasitic, drawing psychic energy from the fear and submission of other beings. But this energy was not unlimited. The king had to constantly maintain his population of fear sources, and too much contact with fearless beings could actually weaken him. What happens if the king cannot feed? She asked Vex during one session. This is impossible. All beings fear the king. But what if it was possible? Hypothetically? Vex seemed uncomfortable with the question. Such speculation serves no purpose. The king has always been strong. The king will always be strong. But the scientist's discomfort told Hanna that Vex did know the answer to her question. The king could be weakened, and Vex was afraid to even think about what that might mean. She began sharing her observations with the other human prisoners through their hidden communication network. Together, they started documenting everything. They could learn about alien technology, social structures, and the king's feeding habits. Minsu had been assigned to work on ship maintenance and was able to provide technical details about alien engineering. Tae-young had access to diplomatic archives and could explain the political structure of the empire. Kyung-ho sent reports from the biological research labs where he was being studied. They are definitely studying us to try to understand why we do not break like other species, Kyung-ho reported. But I think our behavior is making some of the researchers uncomfortable. They keep asking why we continue to hope when hope is clearly irrational. Because hope is not about rationality, Hanna replied. It is about possibility. As long as possibilities exist, humans will pursue them. As days passed, Hanna noticed changes in the alien researchers who worked with human prisoners. They asked more questions, showed more curiosity, and seemed less afraid to express opinions that might contradict official doctrine. Vex was the most dramatic example. The researcher began visiting Hanna even when not officially assigned to study her, and their conversations ranged far beyond human biology into philosophy, science, and the nature of knowledge itself. I have been thinking about your questions, Vex admitted during one late-night visit. About what happens if the king becomes weak. I found records from the early days of the empire, before my species was conquered. What did you find? The king was not always so powerful. His species was small and struggling when they first discovered their ability to feed on fear. They became strong by conquering weaker species, but their power has limits. Hanna leaned forward eagerly. What kind of limits? The fear must be pure and constant. If beings stop fearing the king, or if they feel other emotions more strongly than fear, the king begins to starve. And if the king starves long enough, he dies. He becomes mortal again. Just another being who can be killed or defeated like any other. This was the information Hanna had been hoping for. She now understood why the king had seemed disturbed by her lack of fear. He had never encountered beings who were naturally immune to his primary weapon. But knowledge was only the first step. Now she needed to figure out how to use this information to free not just the humans, but all the species trapped under the king's rule. The irony was not lost on her. She had come to Antarctica to study ancient life trapped in ice. The change started small, almost invisible at first. Hanna noticed that the guards who brought her meals no longer walked with the same rigid precision they had shown before. Their movements seemed slightly more natural, less mechanical. When she greeted them politely in Korean, some of them would tilt their heads as if listening, even though they could not understand her words. More telling were the changes in Vex and the other researchers. What had begun as scientific curiosity about human behavior was evolving into something deeper. They asked questions that went beyond their official assignments, questions about freedom and choice and the possibility of different ways of living. "I have been reading historical records," Vex told her during one of their sessions. "Before the king conquered my people, we had something called individual research projects. Scientists could choose what to study based on their own interests rather than imperial needs." "That sounds like academic freedom," Hanna said. "Human. Scientists have always worked that way. We believe the best discoveries come when researchers can follow their curiosity wherever it leads. But how do you coordinate research without central control? How do you prevent scientists from wasting time on useless projects?" Hanna smiled. "We do not prevent it. We accept that some research will fail or lead nowhere. But we also know that the biggest breakthroughs often come from unexpected directions. The scientist studying ice bacteria might discover something that helps the physicist understand gravity." Through her hidden communication network, Hanna learned that similar conversations were happening throughout the ship. Human prisoners were sharing their perspectives on freedom, creativity, and self-determination with alien researchers and workers. The ideas were spreading like a virus through the ship's population. Minsu reported that engineering crews were beginning to ask why certain systems were designed the way they were, rather than simply accepting them as unchangeable. Tae-young noticed that diplomatic staff were questioning whether conquest was really the only way to interact with new species. Most significantly, Kyung-ho observed that the biological research teams were showing increased stress responses. "They are starting to experience emotions they do not understand," he reported. "The concept of hope is making them anxious because they have no framework for processing it." But the changes were not limited to individual aliens. Hanna began to notice systemic effects throughout the ship. The lighting seemed less uniform, with some areas becoming brighter and others dimmer. The automated systems that had responded instantly to her requests now sometimes delayed or provided unexpected options. She realized that the ship's systems were somehow connected to the psychological state of their operators. As the aliens became less rigidly controlled and more creative in their thinking, their technology was becoming less predictable and more flexible. This discovery led to a breakthrough in her understanding of the Empire's structure. The king's power was not just political or military, but technological as well. His ability to suppress independent thought in his subjects was what allowed their technology to function with perfect efficiency and coordination. "The entire empire is built on psychological control," she explained to her human network. "Their ships work perfectly because everyone thinks the same way. Their society is stable because no one questions orders. But if beings start thinking independently, the whole system becomes unstable." The implications were staggering. Humans were not just immune to the king's fear-based control, they were actively undermining it simply by being themselves. Every conversation between a human and an alien introduced concepts that weakened the psychological foundations of the empire. But Hanna also realized that this process was dangerous for the aliens themselves. Beings who had lived for centuries without independent thought were not equipped to handle sudden freedom. Some of the researchers working with humans were showing signs of severe psychological distress. "We need to be more careful," she told the other humans. "We are helping these beings remember how to think freely, but freedom can be overwhelming for someone who has never experienced it." She began working with Vex to develop what she called gradual liberation protocols. Instead of challenging fundamental assumptions directly, She would pose questions that led the alien researcher to discover contradictions and alternatives on their own. What would happen if we designed this experiment differently? She might ask instead of, "Your experimental design is flawed." The approach worked better than direct confrontation. Vex and other researchers began developing their own questions and pursuing their own lines of inquiry. Most importantly, they started communicating with each other about their discoveries, sharing ideas without going through official channels. This informal communication network among the researchers was exactly what Han-Na had hoped for. Ideas and questions spread from one alien to another, creating a cascade of independent thinking that grew stronger with each exchange. But their success was also drawing attention from higher levels of the hierarchy. Minsu reported that security patrols had increased around areas where humans were housed. Tae-young noticed that diplomatic communications were being monitored more closely. Most ominously, several alien researchers who had worked with humans were reassigned to other duties without explanation. Han-Na worried that the king was beginning to understand the threat that human prisoners represented to his empire. Her fears were confirmed when Vex arrived for what turned out to be their final session together. The alien researcher's behavior was different, more cautious and formal than it had been in weeks. "I have been ordered to discontinue our research collaboration," Vex announced through the translator. "My superiors believe that extended contact with human subjects is affecting my objectivity." "They are right," Han-Na said quietly. "Contact with us is affecting your objectivity. The question is whether you think that is a good thing or a bad thing." Vex was silent for a long time, staring at the notes they had compiled together over their many sessions. Finally, the alien spoke without using the translator, struggling with human words but managing to communicate. I think it is a good thing. For first time in my life I have thoughts that are mine alone. I have questions that no one told me to ask. Then you understand why humans fight even when we cannot win. Freedom of thought is worth any price. Yes. But understanding and achieving are different things. The king grows suspicious of changes in his subjects. Soon he will take action to restore control. What kind of action? Memory adjustment for affected individuals. Increased psychological conditioning. And if necessary, elimination of the source of contamination. Han-Na felt a chill despite the warm air in her quarters. The human prisoners. The king cannot afford to let your influence spread further. Already there are reports of unusual behavior in multiple ship sections. Some beings are refusing direct orders. Others are asking questions about empire policies. This level of independent thought has not been seen in centuries. The gravity of the situation was clear. By being themselves, the humans had accidentally started a revolution. But revolutions without proper organization usually ended in disaster for everyone involved. Vex, I need you to do something for me. Can you get a message to the other researchers who have worked with humans? Perhaps. What message? Tell them that if they want to keep their newfound freedom of thought, they need to be very careful how they express it. The king will try to identify and eliminate everyone who has been affected by human influence. They need to appear normal while secretly organizing. You want them to pretend to be controlled while actually being free? Exactly. And more than that, I want them to quietly spread the ideas they have learned to others. But they must do it, gradually and carefully so the king does not notice until it is too late to stop. Vex nodded slowly. This is what humans call a conspiracy. This is what humans call survival. Your people were explorers and scientists once. They can be again, but only if they remember how to think for themselves. After Vex left, Han-Na contacted her human network with urgent messages. The situation was about to become much more dangerous, but they had also identified the king's greatest vulnerability. His power depended entirely on the psychological submission of his subjects. Every being who learned to think independently was a crack in the foundation of his empire. If enough beings broke free of his mental control, the entire structure would collapse. The question was whether they could spread the revolution fast, enough to reach critical mass before the king realized what was happening and moved to destroy them all. Hanna stared at the wall displays showing the conquered worlds of the Empire and felt a familiar excitement. She was about to conduct the most important experiment of her career, with the freedom of an entire galaxy as the potential result. The variables were complex and the outcome uncertain, but the hypothesis was clear. Even the most powerful tyrant could be defeated by the simple act of refusing to be afraid. The alarm started at what Hanna estimated was 3 a.m, ship time. Red lights flashed through her quarters while a piercing sound echoed through the corridors. She had been expecting something like this ever since Vex warned her about the king's growing suspicions. Through her hidden communication network, she received frantic messages from other human prisoners. Security forces were moving through the ship, arresting aliens who had worked with humans and conducting what appeared to be loyalty tests on research staff. "They took Minsu 20 minutes ago," reported Tae-young. "Armed guards, full arrest protocol. I think they are rounding up all the humans." "Kyung-ho is not responding to messages," added another prisoner. His last transmission said guards were approaching the biology labs. Hanna felt sick with worry for her brother and the other humans, but she also recognized this crisis as an opportunity. If the king was reacting this strongly, it meant their influence had spread further than she had dared to hope. The Empire was showing signs of real instability. Her door burst open without warning, and 6 guards entered with weapons drawn. But these were not the same controlled, precise soldiers she had seen before. Their movements were slightly erratic, and she could see tension in their postures that suggested internal conflict. The guard captain spoke in the musical alien language, but one of the others translated in broken English. "You come now. King wants to see all humans." As they escorted her through the corridors, Hanna observed signs of chaos throughout the ship. Some sections were running on emergency lighting while others were completely dark. Automated systems that had always functioned perfectly were malfunctioning or shutting down entirely. More telling were the aliens themselves. Many moved in small groups, whispering to each other in ways that suggested conspiracy. Others stood alone, staring at nothing with expressions of confusion or wonder, as if seeing their surroundings clearly for the first time. The throne room had changed dramatically since her first visit. The crystal formations that preserved the fear of conquered beings were flickering and unstable. Several had already gone dark, their contents vanishing as if they had never existed. The floating platforms that held court officials were swaying uncertainly, no longer locked in perfect formation. King Vorthak sat on his throne, but he looked nothing like the imposing figure Hanna remembered. His skin had lost much of its pale glow, and the moving patterns that covered his body were fading to gray. Most shocking was his size. He seemed to have shrunk by at least a third, no longer towering over his subjects. The other human prisoners were already assembled in the center of the chamber, guarded by increasingly nervous soldiers. Hanna was relieved to see that Kyung-ho and Minsu were among them, though they looked rougher than when she had last seen them. The king spoke, and his voice was weaker than before, lacking the commanding presence that had defined their previous encounter. Jiho translated with a voice that was no longer flat and emotionless but filled with barely contained excitement. "The king says that the human contamination has spread too far to be contained through normal methods. He has decided that all humans must be destroyed immediately to prevent further damage to imperial stability." "And what do you think about that, Jiho?" Hanna asked, noticing that the translator was no longer staring at the ground in submission. Jiho looked up at her with eyes that were alive for the first time since she had seen him in this chamber. "I think the king is afraid, and I do not remember the last time I saw him show fear." A murmur went through the assembled court officials at this unprecedented display of independent thought from a previously broken human. Several of the alien nobles on the floating platforms began talking among themselves, ignoring the king's presence entirely. King Vorthak tried to project his mental pressure into the chamber, the same psychic force that had maintained his control for 3 millennia. But the effect was weak and scattered, failing to impose the absolute terror that had been his primary weapon. Hanna felt the king's mental touch like a gentle breeze rather than the crushing force she had experienced before. Around her, the other humans stood firm, showing curiosity rather than fear. More importantly, many of the aliens in the chamber were also resisting the king's influence, their faces showing confusion and anger instead of submission. "You are dying," Hanna said, addressing the king directly. "Your power came from the fear of your subjects, but they are not afraid anymore. We showed them that fear is a choice and they are choosing differently." The king's response was a roar of rage that shook the chamber, but even his anger seemed diminished and hollow. Several of the crystal formations cracked at the sound, releasing their trapped victims into empty air. "Impossible," the king said in heavily accented English, abandoning his translator. "I have ruled for 3,000 years. I have conquered 1,000,000 worlds. I am eternal." "Nothing is eternal," Hanna replied. "Everything changes. Everything evolves. Everything ends. You built your empire on a foundation of psychological control, but you never learned to adapt when that foundation was challenged." Around the chamber, she could see the king's subjects watching this exchange with growing fascination. Many of them had never seen anyone speak to their ruler as an equal, let alone challenge his fundamental assumptions about power and control. Vex appeared on one of the floating platforms, along with several other researchers who had worked with human prisoners. They looked different from the last time Hanna had seen them. More confident, more alive, more like the independent scientists they had been before their conquest. "The human Hanna speaks truth," Vex announced to the chamber. "We have studied the psychological effects of human contact on imperial subjects. The results show that exposure to human concepts of freedom and independent thought creates irreversible changes in brain chemistry and behavior." "Irreversible," another researcher added. "Once a being learns to think freely, they cannot be forced back into absolute submission without destroying their capacity for thought entirely." King Vorthak tried to stand from his throne but stumbled, his weakened body no longer able to support his diminished presence. "Then I will destroy them all," he gasped. "I will burn every world that has been contaminated. I will start over with new species." "With what army?" asked a voice from the crowd of court officials. Hanna could not see who had spoken, but the question sparked murmurs of agreement throughout the chamber. For the first time, King Vorthak looked around his throne room and seemed to truly see what was happening. His subjects were no longer bowing in submission. They were standing upright, looking at each other instead of at him, talking among themselves instead of waiting for his commands. "The empire is collapsing," Minsu observed quietly. "Look at the technological systems. They are failing because the minds that operated them are no longer perfectly synchronized." He was right. Throughout the chamber, Hanna could see evidence of system failures. Floating platforms were losing altitude. The crystal formations were continuing to flicker and fade, and even the basic lighting was becoming unstable. "This is what happens when a society built on absolute control encounters absolute freedom," Tae-young added. "The structures cannot adapt quickly enough to survive the transition." But the collapse was not just destroying the king's power. It was also creating opportunities for something new to emerge. Groups of aliens were forming spontaneous councils, discussing how to manage their ships and territories without central authority. Former slaves were organizing themselves into cooperative networks. "What happens now?" Kyung-ho asked. Hanna looked around the chamber at the beings who were experiencing freedom for the first time in their lives. Some appeared confused and frightened by the sudden absence of absolute authority. Others seemed energized by the possibilities that lay before them. "Now they learn to live without a king," she said. "It will not be easy, and it will not be perfect. Freedom is messier and more complicated than tyranny, but it is also more creative and more adaptable." King Vorthak made one final attempt to reassert his authority, raising his weapons against the human prisoners. But his own guards hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly instead of immediately following his commands. "Why do you wait?" "The king demanded. "Destroy them." One of the guards, the same one who had translated earlier, slowly lowered his weapon. "Because they taught us to ask questions," he said. "And my question is, why should we obey someone who rules through fear when we are no longer afraid?" It was a simple question, but it struck at the heart of everything the Empire had been built upon. Throughout the chamber, weapons were lowered as beings who had never questioned authority in their lives suddenly found themselves questioning everything. The king's reign did not end with violence or dramatic battle. It ended with a question, asked by a common soldier, who had learned from humans that authority must be earned rather than imposed. As the months that followed would prove, the galaxy that emerged from the Empire's collapse was chaotic and unpredictable. Some regions fell into warfare as different species competed for resources and territory. Others formed peaceful confederations based on mutual cooperation and shared interests. But throughout this transition, the ideas that humans had introduced continued to spread.